Joining us for today's webinar, Conducting Community Resource Inventories to Stir Victims of Human Trafficking. My name is Allison Friedman, and I'm with OJJDP's National Training and Technical Assistance Center. As your technical host, I would like to take a couple of minutes to discuss a few features of the Adobe Connect webinar platform and provide a few announcements to keep in mind. For those wishing to download a copy of the PowerPoint slides and other important documents, you may do so by locating the handouts pod directly above the chat pod. Click on the name of the file and then click the download button. During today's webinar, there will be a Q&A session where the presenter will address some of the questions posed during the presentation. Please type your questions into the Q&A pod as they arise. For those of you participating in today's webinar as a group, please take a minute and help us count. Go to the chat window and type in the total number of additional people in the room with you today. If you are viewing alone, there is no need to type anything into the chat pod at this time. At the conclusion of today's webinar, you will be provided with a link to a brief survey about today's presentation. The feedback you provide is used to assist in future planning and training. Following today's webinar, attendees will be sent a certificate of attendance. This certificate is sent approximately 1 hour following the conclusion of the event and is sent via an Adobe Connect thank you email. Please keep an eye on your email for your certificate. Finally, this event will be archived in approximately 3 weeks on OJJDP's online university at www.ojjdpou.org, where you can also view past webinars. Again, thank you for joining us today. I will now turn it over to our moderator for today's webinar, Nadia Ellie from Fox Valley Technical College, to begin today's event.
Thank you, Allison. As Allison mentioned, my name is Nadia Ely, and I'm a project coordinator with the National Criminal Justice Training Center of Fox Valley Technical College. The Amber Alert Training and Technical Assistance Program has partnered with OJJDP's National Training and Technical Assistance Center to host this webinar as part of our Amber Alert webinar series. In conjunction with our mission, this series works to bring together state, local, and tribal subject matter experts to present and discuss critical issues related to missing, abducted, and exploited children. To learn more about the Amber Alert program, our training and technical assistance opportunities, and to view past webinars, please visit the web link provided on this slide. And without further ado, I'd like to turn today's presentation over to our presenter and subject matter expert, Bill Carney.
Thank you, Nadia. It's wonderful to see the interest in this topic and all of you that have been able to join us. And it's also very interesting to see where everyone is from as well, as you've typed that in as you've come into the webinar. So as we look at today's webinar, we have two objectives. The first is to examine a framework to build a community resource inventory. And then secondly, what are some best practices for developing that organizational network to produce a sustainable community-wide services for victims of human trafficking? Because there really isn't going to be a one-size-fit-all or one approach to it. Let's get started. So from my experience with any kind of planning, you want to start with the desired ends in mind. That way, we can bring everyone along that needs to come along with us as part of our work group or our coalition. So you think about the questions that you want to have answered up front that are going to help with your planning process. And on this slide, you can see a number of examples. And we start with what is or are the specific areas of focus when you're talking about human trafficking for your community. There's a wide range of different populations affected and ways of looking at it. So for our purposes today, we're looking at domestic minor sex trafficking or child sex trafficking. And that will be the example that we're using throughout the webinar. But you may be experiencing adult human trafficking. You also may be experiencing labor trafficking in your community. It's the same kind of approach and the same kind of thinking. You're going to end up with different results within your planning. So you do want to be specific about that. You also want to ask, what's our current experience? Who's doing what? What are the gaps in services that we're experiencing, that professionals are talking about? And as a community, what do we think we can accomplish? What agencies and organizations, right down to what individuals can play what roles? Another element that's interesting too is looking and asking, is this an issue for just our jurisdiction, or is this affecting jurisdictions around us as well? Do we need to make this multi-jurisdictional, or as we're working on our approach, do we need to connect with other jurisdictions and what their approaches are, because we're seeing movement of those being trafficked from those communities, so we want to possibly coordinate with them. And then finally, fully realized, what would it look like? What's the end state? What is our desire as we think of child sex trafficking, and what we want our end result to be? The result in doing this kind of planning is we should be able to establish goals and a vision for our work group or our coalition, and the result being goals for your effort that capture your starting point of creating that inventory, and secondly, building that representative group that can lead that effort. And all that leads into then a vision statement, and it is something that you want ultimately your multidisciplinary work group to have. So I have an example here, and it's just meant to be an example, like together we can protect and when necessary reclaim our children and youth for our community. So if we look at domestic sex trafficking victims, we really can start by just recognizing that all of our youth in our communities are vulnerable to sex trafficking, and that has to do with today's access, social media, and ways of possibly being lured, as well as current social issues as well. So there is a recognition that all of our youth are potentially vulnerable, but on top of that, there may be subgroups that are more at risk, and from that standpoint, you want to have a special focus and really understand in your community who may be the most at risk. So this slide shows examples, and as you look at the examples on this list, if you have any other at-risk youth populations that you would add to this at-risk list, feel free to type it in and share it with the group as well. And as I continue on and we look at different slides as people add to the chat, take a look over and see. Foster youth, absolutely, thank you. Thank you, Dave, for that. So, look at that as we continue on of who else is added to the list. And with system-involved youth, that's our foster care youth, it's our juvenile justice-involved youth, yes, our teen parents, Native American youth, yes, the youth in juvenile justice. So we're seeing a great list here. Now, as we continue on, we also might have hidden potential victims as well. So think a little bit deeper, not just those that we identify that are more obvious, and some of the great examples we have start to get into this hidden list as well. It may be certain ethnic communities where we're not seeing social issues bubble up per se and that it gets on our radar, but it may be happening. It may be across gender where we stereotypically think sex trafficking, female. It may be an issue with our males as well. I saw someone share the list, low IQ, cognitively limited. That is where our access and functional needs youth are definitely a hidden population potentially as well. Military connected, those exposed to domestic violence, Corinne shared as well. Familial tracked youth as well. So think not only here's who's at risk, but delve that little bit deeper, who may be hidden as well. So there's a lot of different ways of looking at child sex trafficking, and one way may be a justice-oriented view where we're looking at perpetrator and we're looking at our legal system. But we can also look at it, and today we are looking at it from a broader victim-centered approach to trafficking minors. And here is where we're looking then at 5 elements or 5 components that we want to address in our communities as part of our community-wide approach and a victim-centered approach. Now, as you look at these topics, protect, recognize, recover, restore, build resilience, you could take any one of these topics and you can do a full webinar or a full day training on it as well. For our purposes today, we're going to delve a little bit deeper and just give us a foundation or a basis on each as we continue through the webinar. So as we turn and look, starting with protection, protection is about preventing incidents of trafficking from happening. This can involve all parts of our community, and you'll see as we do a community inventory, everyone in our community, we need a level of education, awareness, prevention, and early intervention efforts that can happen during that protection element, with that protection element. Secondly, we have recognition, and here we're focusing on identifying signs and trends and investigating what we're seeing. So if you look, there is a hand-in-hand with our protection and recognition elements that we want an aware community, and we also want that community-wide eyes-on recognizing signs and symptoms so that they're able to bring that to professionals and those that can investigate what's happening as well. If we look at recovery, recovery focuses on creating a credible relationship or rapport at the time of contact to establish a relationship to support the young person leaving being trafficked. It's important here to understand a lot of young people who are being trafficked do not think of themselves as being trafficked. That's not their terminology. They're going to respond defensively to that, and it's a different frame of reference for them, and that is where with recovery, that actual approach, that contact and approaching the young person properly is going to be very critical and important. Restoration, here's where we're focusing on the needs to help the young person, those medium-term needs, and we're helping them see and helping them choose alternatives that help put them on a healthy path and help take them from being a victim to a survivor. So if you look on the slide, you can see the type of what's during recovery, that we're meeting basic needs in medical and detox, legal, setting up that rapport and support with them. And you can see with restoration where those heavier services are now coming in that are helping them do that transition. Yes, Amanda, I think good point as well. And that's where, as I do the slides, I'm able to glance now and then over to chats as well. But I think Amanda makes a good point that it is during restoration when trauma-focused therapy can begin as well. Looking then at the fifth element is where we're focusing on the more long-term needs to support success for that young person. These services do fit together and provide a comprehensive and seamless, if possible. The more seamless we can make it, the better the support. And here's where you can see other support services layering in as well. You see transportation, financial stability, education and employment, that job readiness in areas like that, and a level of case management as we go along as well. So those are the 5 elements. And then as we look at our community, now we need a way of organizing our community and looking at it as sectors or some means of organizing so that we can engage and make it manageable as we have a strategy that's community-wide. In our example here, there's 14 sectors, and we're going to go through each of the sectors to a level of detail. Now, in your community, you may have a different organizing approach. If you do, again, please feel free to share that in the chat as well, because I think there's good information that we're getting from your involvement in via the chat with this as well. So, but looking at it for this purposes, we've identified 14 in a way of looking at organizing our community. So now let's take a look at each sector in greater detail and see who'd be included. And I'm going to start with youth. Starting with youth, here we're focusing on how can we involve youth in our work group and have their input and have them share their insight in our planning. We want them involved. Here, we really do have to be very cautious and make sure that we're creating authentic relationships, and that's where some of these teen councils, youth groups, school groups, church groups, etc., that's where there's a level of leadership programming happening. The young people are prepared to be to participate in their community, be part of groups like this as well. So, you know, that's where you look. Here it is where we're looking for direct engagement of youth and what are our means of reaching them. So here are some examples. And again, I encourage anyone else to type in anything, any other youth group that you have as an example that you would add to this as well. So if we continue, parents are going to be the same. We're going to look at where can we reach them. And it may be via school, church, youth programs or activities, community events. We may look at specialized groups like foster parent groups, or if there's any survivor advocate groups of parents of those that have been sexually trafficked. So we want to bring parents into our work group as well and have parent representatives. Turning to schools now, as we look at schools, you can see that there's different school officials that can play different roles. So it does go from leadership at that district and school level and the roles they can play right through helping a young person transition back into school after they've been trafficked and making that a, as smooth as possible transition, or the steps to being able to do it. Right through, you see support services on that list, and that includes bus drivers, school bus drivers, cafeteria workers, maintenance workers, because as you look at those support functions, they're hearing a lot, they're learning a lot. If they're trained and they understand what to look for, they can be helpful in that recognition phase. So it is looking at everyone within our school systems can play a role as well, and we want that right representation that can then go back to our schools and bring the information from our coalition back. Moving to youth serving organizations, this first slide of youth serving organizations are, call it that, those general youth development, recreational, activity-oriented organizations that serve all of our youth community-wide. So it is from recreation leagues through scouting and the YM and YWCAs, Girls Inc., community and schools. You see the list. You may have additional examples of youth organizations as well, and included right on this as well as those private providers. We do want to think of those that are working with our young people through, call it instructional programming and lessons and skill development. We want them to be part of our approach as well, and understanding and being able to share information with them, because again, even as a young person's transitioning from being trafficked, that this is part of the services that they need, being part of their community as well. So if we look next at a more specific group of youth serving organizations, these are more service or system foster care, juvenile justice specific organizations. They may have custody or contact with young people that, with some of those young people, they have been trafficked or are currently being actively trafficked, other than they're now in custody. And you can see the critical role that they can play in every element of your community's victim-centered approach. So that's where we want to make sure that we have a good, specific, detailed inventory of these resources as well, and make sure that they're involved in our approach. Okay, and I see a comment about changing the term with the women's shelter, and I will do that. With military community, if you look, the military in your community may be guard or reserve facilities, it may be an armory, right up through, you may be a community that has an installation or multiple installations nearby. In that case, you want to involve those military officials. If it is at that guard and reserve facility level or armory, they will have family readiness groups that are helping support deployment and that level of trauma that the family will go through with deployment and then reintegration back. Right through, if it's a full installation, post-garrison, all the names we know, fort. Here's where we may want to involve the military police, and those type of installations have child and youth services staff. And this is in recognition that their youth are vulnerable with all that's happening on. If it's active duty youth, children of active duty soldiers, they may have moved multiple times, and that has an impact. If it's if it's Guard and Reserve, it may be the deployment that's having the impact. So we do want to think of that. We had them as a hidden group potentially on our list. And we also want to think from the standpoint that where we have installations that that have that younger single soldier, they may be a draw for trafficking. That's where that is where youth may be trafficked to near those kind of posts and garrisons. As they're more on the demand side of the issue as well. So that's where we want to engage our military resources in our community as part of our approach. Turning to faith community, our faith community can and oftentimes they do play a critical role as members addressing child sex trafficking. You can see on the list from being part of protection and recognition that even some of the ministries, some of the social services provided help play a role with those restorative and resiliency services that those that are trafficked are needing. So, look at how they can be engaged, how they're looking to be engaged. It can be also their community ecumenical groups across faiths, or it may be, the organizing diocese or regional functions across any of the faiths. But that is where we really want to look, and I can say from experience in some of our communities, it's our faith communities that may be leading the effort, and that's the role that they're playing of helping organize and helping make sure the right resources are being brought. As we go to our business community, the business community can be a supportive partner. They can help with community awareness, and then they can help recognize sign of trafficking through their businesses. They can help with jobs as those survivors of trafficking are in that restoration and resiliency phase and are looking to be employed and need jobs. It can get down into specific industries and what the specific information can be. So as an example, with motels and hotels, the staff, the personnel, whether it be those that do the cleaning through front desk, they may recognize and report signs of trafficking if they're trained on what to be looking for, and they know who to be reporting it to. So it is where we want to have our businesses engaged. The transportation industry is another in terms of very mobile, and they may see signs and may be helpful in identifying child sex trafficking. Also, you want to be aware of it from the standpoint of when you have major events, playoffs, concerts, conferences. That's where also the business community can help identify and address trafficking at those times in your community as well. Moving to civic and volunteer organizations. Here, the civic organizations can play a similar supportive role that our business and faith communities can play, and the volunteer organizations, the Salvation Army, Goodwill Industries, and if you have other examples of good volunteer organizations in your community, if you can type it into the chat box as well. But here, these volunteer organizations can help with providing, and they do help provide needed services for our recovered youth. Looking at media, our media sources can help. They can help with our community awareness our community awareness efforts, and they can help get the word out. And again, the more familiar and aware and educated they are about the issue, as they're doing reporting, they may be able to identify signs and trends and be able to help be part of recognition as well. If we look at law enforcement plays a core critical role. While the list looks simple here, police department, sheriff's office, state police, federal law enforcement resources that are in your community, different departmental units will play different roles. So as an example, patrol and first responders can play a role critical to making that connection for recovery, dealing with the victim rather than dealing with the perpetrator. So how they approach the young person may in fact really determine and define, is this young person going to be able to be recovered, and can we start a recovery process with them? So they play an important role. Our detectives divisions or units, our special units like VICE, and if you have a domestic minority sex trafficking specific unit, those specialized units can play a role, and we want them at the table. And then a lot of these departments and offices have victims advocates that are part of their operation, and they can help the trafficked victim navigate the legal system and can help them access services and play a critical role from recovery into the restoration process as well. So, and if anyone has examples of how law enforcement in your community is playing a role, or different units than I've described, share that in the chat as well. Moving on to government agencies, here's where Child Protection Services, Juvenile Probation, Department of Juvenile Justice, Detention, getting into then District Attorney's Office, the courts, the Office of State Attorney General, U.S. Attorney's Office, elected and appointed government officials. Here's where these offices, from custody through those legal systems, they play a key role and are important partners as you come together. Prosecutors also have victim advocates as part of their operation typically as well, that help the victim through the process and with services as well, as we see with the police department. Looking at healthcare providers have a unique view of the issue, and they can play a critical role. They can observe and report signs. They can establish relationships to begin the recovery process. They can provide much needed health services for victims, short, medium, and long term. So they're a very critical and important partner, and you can see the nature and type of different healthcare providers, and if anyone has additional examples as well, add them to the list. I see Diana put SANE nurses. Absolutely, they are a terrific resource as a specific example. And moving to mental health care providers, very similar to the healthcare, they play a similar critical role from every element of it, and this includes from from a system through private therapists, through mental retardation centers, that the role that they can play. Good, I'm seeing great examples in the chat box, and keep those coming in, because that adds to what's being said in the presentation. As we look at treatment, recovery, and service providers, this broader group of service providers in your community can provide that medium and long-term services to help with restoration and with the development of resiliency, the long-term services that are needed. So we want them at the table as well. Some of our communities we do now have domestic, minor, sex trafficking advocacy and service providers, and that's where we're going to see more and more of those, where it's more specific, and they can play a critical role in that they can provide very specific, accurate, detailed information that help us better frame the issue, better plan our responses, and provide victim survivor specific services. They can also provide peer-to-peer relationships where young people transition from being trafficked as well. Looking at our university and research, that wraps university and research community. Here, beyond protecting college students who are also a vulnerable population, we might put that on our hidden population list as well, that here they can also, beyond looking in and protecting college students and playing the role for college students, they also can play a role as a research component for your efforts. They can research what's working, proven approaches elsewhere that can be brought to your community. They can also provide evaluation support to measure your progress and your success as well. So as we put all of this together, you can now look, we take those 5 elements of a victim-centered approach as our columns, and you take these areas of our sectors of our community, and you can see for the first time then who can provide what. This is then looking down. This is only an example here. Yours may look very different for your community, but you can look at, you can go through this process. This gives you that 35,000 feet looking down on your community. Here's what we look like. Here's what we have. Here's what we may need to focus on and really, as a group or organization, spend more time on. But this is the first time we get that view of what a community inventory matrix for our community may look like. So now, let's talk about, as we've identified sectors and possible roles, now let's focus on process. Now let's look at that domestic minority sex trafficking work group and the development of that work group. And let's start first with how are we going to engage our stakeholders. And first, really as a part of it, we need to make sure that we're bringing our specific community characteristics into our planning as specific as possible. There is no one cookie cutter way of looking at it. We've done work with communities that have had heavy military around the community. That has a factor of who the community is and what the planning process is versus a very heavy nonprofit community where nonprofits play a significant role. We've also worked in faith communities where the faith community plays a large significant role. Those are important elements in planning. What is going to be best for our community as who we're going to reach out to and how we're able to reach them. So be strategic about your community and make sure to bring in those factors so that there is credibility. Secondly, build a credible, diverse core. You can see there's 14 sectors that we identified, and you can see there's a lot of people in the different sectors. You're going to need a core of people. Typically, that can be anywhere as small as 8. It can be up in the 30s or 40s, which is rather large, but there needs to be a core that's really doing the management, convening, bringing everyone together. And that's where within that, we're looking to leverage existing networks. So as an example, if your community has a coalition of youth service providers or family service providers that meets on a monthly basis, then you want a representative from that group as part of your work group, and then you want them leveraging back in through their network to be able to reach that broader net. We want to be able to broadcast into networks and be able to get information out. So you're looking and thinking strategically of how we're doing that. Next, the meeting, where you meet, how you meet, all of that's going to matter. And again, giving the examples of, you know, a community that may be very nonprofit focused. Well, you may be best hosted at a nonprofit site for your initial meetings, and then let the group decide from there. If it's faith-based, it may be that is the best place to have your initial meetings. And you look at that carefully. As an example, if your community that's heavy into not being dependent on the government, there's a theme of independence and individualism, then you're not going to look to have your meeting in a government center as an example, because then it'll be looked at as a government meeting. So then, as we had on one of those first slides, of asking the right questions as we come together, looking at what do we need to ask, what do we need to focus on, and we had examples of some of those. Also, as we're bringing people in, we want them to think beyond their specific disciplines. You know, I've seen some great examples with law enforcement helping educate other law enforcement in some of these kind of meetings on a broader perspective than just the traditional law enforcement perspective for the greater need of the community. You want that developed shared vision and reachable goals that we shared earlier at the starting point, and you want to have and set doable actions. You want to be able to the group needs to feel like they're able to do something and accomplish. So that's an element of it that's important within your planning as well. If we look, Setting our group culture, it's going to be critical to your success because this is a different group. It may be a new group to you. Setting that group culture, what is and what isn't acceptable to the group, it shouldn't be left to chance. If you don't manage the culture of the group, that will be the management of the group, that it will just be left to chance, and that could impact your effectiveness very heavily. So here's some examples, and these are just a handful of samples. This in and of itself can be its own webinar as well, but be inclusive, not exclusive, and sometimes it's easy to be exclusive and say, you know, it's easier not to have a certain group or organization or entity part of our approach, but you're going to get better results having them at the table and doing the work it takes to try to look at how do we come together. Look to respect differences, but also look to leverage and take advantage of differences as well, so that it's not a one-way and it needs to look like this, but let's be as inclusive as possible with the differences and celebrate those differences. I like using a quote. I can't attribute it anywhere, but the quote I like using is, "It takes an irritant to create a pearl." You know, pearls aren't created in still water lakes. So from that standpoint, we want the differences. We want to be inclusive, and we'll come out with a better product. I think a key and core element, you need to agree to do what you're going to do and do it. There needs to be a culture. If we say we're going to do it, we do it. And if we don't do it, we acknowledge we didn't do it and we recommit we will do it in the future. But if we end up with a culture where people agree to things at the end of a meeting and then the next time you get together no one's done anything, that can't be acceptable. This issue is too important and you will lose your group. You won't last a couple more meetings potentially. So these are things to keep in mind up front as you're doing your planning. Build on consensus on issues. The difference between agreement and consensus. Agreement is having everyone agree, and that's its own process. But if you look at what consensus is when we have an issue, everyone's had an opportunity to contribute to it, everyone's been heard. There's a feeling that everyone was respected within that dialogue and conversation, and as a group, even though it may not be what you proposed, you can agree with the outcome and you can support that outcome. So being consensus-oriented can be important as well. And then another phase is looking at the group phases, and this is just something very natural to any group. You're going to form, then you're going to storm, and this is that element of different cultures coming together. That will be part of it to then come to that point where you begin to norm as a group and ultimately perform. That will take a series of meetings, but it's recognizing that. It's not getting frustrated at the storming phase and thinking, so this is it, but it's using the above things, respecting, working through consensus, doing what you say you do, that can help take you from storm to norm, heading towards perform as well. So all of those are key and important. So looking then at stakeholder consensus and conflict, we can recognize that there's going to be consensus around wanting to help domestic minor sex trafficked victims, and there'll be consensus around the level of services you want to provide, right down to looking at the most seamless, the most effective. Communities want to support these young people and help reclaim them, and that's understood. But recognize there are a whole number of natural system conflicts that really are right versus right in nature. It's not one's right and one's wrong, but they're right versus right in nature, but they're conflicts just the same that your group is going to need to deal with. And so as you look at that and looking at this list, victim priority versus prosecution priority, we may say that we are about the victim, but then our justice system is prioritizing prosecution, and that's impacting the victim. That's a potential tension that needs to be addressed as a group as you go along. Victim safety versus victim choice. Here, it may be that a provider sees that for their own protection, a victim should be in secure custody for their own safety, and yet at the same time, the choice of that victim would not to be in a secure placement, and that's a natural tension. There's that trust versus mandated reporting conflict, non-secure versus secure placements, in community placement versus out of community placement. We want to keep them as close to home. There may be better resources with more available in and out of community placement. So you can see with this list, right through information sharing, what we're able to share, what we're not able to share. These are natural. We need to acknowledge them. We need to address areas of conflict like this, and we need not to avoid it. If we avoid it, nothing can be accomplished. We won't move through these natural tensions and come up with what's going to work best for our community. So now, as I'm heading into summary for the webinar, we've applied a victim-centric approach with a sector view of our community to create a community inventory matrix. We've explored each community sector in detail to look at who in your community may be a resource and the role that they can play. And we've discussed the considerations in pulling together a work group to address human trafficking in our community. So as I finish up, I'd like to thank the Amber Alert team of the National Criminal Justice Training Center, and specifically Jim Walters, the Amber Alert Training and Technical Assistance Program Administrator, Byron Fassett of the Dallas Police Department, and Chris Bray, retired from the Phoenix Police Department. I'd also like to thank Andrea Sparks and Alan Schonborn from the Texas Governor's Office's Child Sex Trafficking team. I learned a lot from them, facilitating a number of meetings for them in Texas communities, and their leadership on this issue in Texas is really inspiring. I'd like to close by saying you have a chance to make a difference in your community and for your youth. I wish you the best with your efforts, and know that the National Criminal Justice Training Center, the OJJDP Training and Technical Assistance resources are available with more resources on this topic to help you. So stay engaged with us, and let's protect our youth. And with that, I'm going to turn it over with our moderator, Nadia. And I think Nadia has organized some of your questions that you may have brought up during the presentation that we're going to look at.
Yes, thanks, Bill. And the first question we have for you today is, in the Texas communities you've worked in, which agency has led the charge in developing their working group? And does it make a difference?
Each community, it's been different because of the nature of that community. And you know, so in a community that is more nonprofit oriented in Texas, Austin as an example, the leadership may come from the nonprofit community, and that's the core for the planning and getting it started. Whereas in a faith-based community like a Waco, the faith-based organizations may play that role. So it is going to vary, and it may be the government agencies in another community. It really is going to vary community by community, and that's that be strategic element in your planning.
Thanks, Bill. And the next question is it best practice to establish MOUs with all identified stakeholders?
I think that as you progress and as you mature, having pulled the group together and starting, yes, you are heading towards MOUs and you're heading towards formalizing the relationships. And that also then is starting to document who's providing what services. And then those MOUs then may continue out into the different networks, and certain parts of different sectors' networks may come in closer and be more involved in the actual work group as well.
The next question is regarding communities in which human trafficking task forces have already been established. The task forces are looking to broaden their community inventory to include stakeholders from parallel movements, such as, and focusing on other issues such as domestic violence, IPV, child welfare, sexual assault, etc. what suggestions do you have in helping them both broaden their engagement to other stakeholders, but then also still focusing on the issue of human trafficking?
Yeah, I think that really becomes very organizational in nature of looking at what the purpose of the group is. So if they're broadening, then you may look at and invite in a broader audience. You're also broadening your mission statement for the group and the vision for the group to make it larger, and that may include more elected officials and people at a higher quote policy type level in it. But I would make sure to keep a structure of functioning subgroups on the existing topics like human trafficking and starting them on other topics as well, so that there are specific subgroups or subcommittees that are focused in doing that. If it's one group that's broadening and taking on more issues, that can get confusing with mixed and multiple priorities across groups. So I think it's really looking at that organizationally and how you approach that.
Sure. Thanks, Bill. We've had a number of questions come in regarding examples or documentation of the community inventories that you've participated in the past. Could you just take a moment, and you don't have to name the specific communities, but just to share with the audience your experience working in Texas, some of the partners involved, as well as the meetings that you participated and facilitated?
Sure. And really, if you look at the detailed list of the stakeholders within each of the given sectors, there really is a core across all that as I was developing that, from experience and also, I will say this as well, there's some experience from, the public health community as well. And if you look at drug-free communities and the work of the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration and the Office of National Drug Control Policy with that drug-free community funding, they set up sector-oriented groups and communities, and so it's some of that experience of seeing who comes to the table. But I did then go through specifically different communities in Texas where we did that work and looked to make sure that we included all the examples in those sectors. So I think when you download the slides and you're able to look, I think the work in Texas is represented very well, in those lists. And I think there was a second part to your question, Nadia. I want to make sure I get the full question.
Sure, and thank you for referring back to your list of stakeholders earlier in the webinar. But the audience is looking for more of a specific example of a community that successfully conducted a community inventory and have now moved on to holding meetings and developing task forces to address the issues. So I was wondering if you could just, as part of a case study, share your experiences in one particular community.
Yeah, and that really, I was not involved in each of those steps with a community. In using Texas as the example, I actually came in and facilitated that kickoff meeting in some cases where that work was done by that partner in the community, that nonprofit that convened the group. They did an inventory of who they felt should be at the meeting, but then as they came together as a group, I facilitated the group in the discussion and took them through the questions around, what's needed, with across each of these elements. What do they have in place with, with the protection element, and what are the gaps? Who is at risk and who's potentially at risk in their communities, and how can we reach them? That helped create, well, here's who else we need to include in our coalition as well. So that helped expand as part of next steps who we need to invite. And, as we continued through it, and we went right through resiliency, That's where a lot of those support services, some were in the room, but a number of them were not in the room, and the next steps were how do we engage and invite them as well. And that's where they took that away as next steps, and they continued on. But it was more, I was used as a professional facilitator with the National Criminal Justice Training Center, supporting the Texas Governor's Office on, convening that organizing meeting and information gathering meeting. Does that help?
It does. Thank you, Bill. And I see there are a number of questions coming in regarding training and resources to assist communities in conducting their own inventories, as well as furthering their stakeholder engagement. And I'd like to encourage folks to take a look at some of the resources, both in the areas of training and technical assistance from the Amber Alert Training and Technical Assistance Program. The work that Bill just recently referred to address that question is through the Amber Alert program, and there are resources available by request to assist you in your community, so we'd like to strongly encourage that. I see that there are a couple additional questions that have come in. I'd just like to take a moment to allow others. So let's take a look at what questions have come in. Following stakeholder meetings, there's a question, Bill, about how to end events to inspire attendees to do more, to then go out in their communities and actually do the work. Do you have any additional thoughts you'd like to add there?
Well, I think a key and important element, and this could fall, it wasn't on a specific sector, so thank you for this question, and I think it's a great place to bring this in because this is core and critical as well, and that is if you have domestic minor sex trafficking or human trafficking survivors, those that survivors / advocates that they've gone through the process of having been trafficked to surviving that experience to now being an advocate on the issue. If you have some of those individuals in your community, you want them as part of this coalition, and that's where if your meeting has any type of lunch in the middle of it, or if it's at the end of the meeting, or if it's at the start of the meeting, if you allow them to share some of their perspective and some of their experience, there's a lot of educating that goes along. I see Susan has brought up that they use victim survivors as speakers, and that's it. It may be, at another meeting, I'm seeing someone bring up, having detectives speak. You could have it like that, where it's here we are educating and informing. Here we're going for the emotional element and the experiential element of it to really give us that charge. So I think of the meeting and what you're looking to accomplish and what might be the best message coming out of it, and schedule that. And really going over, this is what we want covered. So it's not a presentation left to chance, but this is really what we're looking for, and really having them practice it with you. If it's a survivor advocate, if they've spoken sometimes but not a lot of times, you really want to make sure they're on point, and you might even do it where it's a short presentation, but you ask questions, and it might be easier to respond to questions, but use it that way. Yep.
And as a follow-up question, I think this is a great question, Bill. It's about maintaining momentum once the group has been meeting for quite some time and they're doing the work in the communities. How would you suggest that they continue to forge ahead? Do you have any additional thoughts there?
Absolutely. It's easy to get fatigued, and it's easy to feel like nothing's being accomplished, and especially a couple meetings in, and you feel like all you're doing is not hearing and understanding each other properly. You're using different terminology. Child welfare may be using different terminology than the schools versus law enforcement versus a survivor advocate, and it can just feel like it's spiraling. But that's where it's looking at what are short-term goals via actions we can take where we can show progress. create the little victories. This is a sports analogy for those that may know sports. If you're not sports oriented, I apologize. But I was always taught if you step onto a basketball court, make your first shot. And there's that element to this that as you bring the group together, you want them to feel a victory. And I think that's where at a first meeting, having someone talk and inspire, making it that there's something being done between the first and second meeting so some level of accomplishment can be shown, and on like that. And I think that as you have accomplishments, if you're able to celebrate people, or if organizations on their own have done something or have had a milestone or an accomplishment, if you're able to bring that in, that can be very important as well, of recognizing that.
Thank you, Bill, for providing your insight and responding to today's audience's questions. Before we close today's event, I'd like to thank you for participating and conducting today's webinar. I'd like to thank OJJDP NTTAC for assisting us in the facilitation of the webinar as well. I'd like to remind our audience that future webinar announcements from the Amber Alert Training and Technical Assistance Program will be made in the upcoming weeks, and just next week we'll be hosting another human trafficking focused webinar, which includes some research as it relates to perpetrators, buyers, as well as Native American victims. And without further ado, I'd like to turn the presentation back over to you, Allison, for close.
Yes, thank you so much for a great discussion. And we just have a few brief reminders. This webinar will be archived on OJJDP's online university in approximately 3 weeks. And for more information, please contact the National Criminal Justice Training Center of Fox Valley. You may also contact OJJDP or NTTAC via the Help Desk by following the contact information on the slide. Lastly, we would appreciate it if you could please take 5 minutes to complete the feedback survey. Thank you again for joining us today, and have a great afternoon.